So first question you've got here, Tristan, reference to figure 1, how might the expected change in the UK's fiscal deficit be explained? 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. 2007 to 2008, the fiscal deficit rises from 2.5% of GDP up to a peak of, so we've got some application marks there. Define what a fiscal deficit is. So if it is an explain question, the deficit is where government spending is greater than tax revenue. This can be explained through fiscal policy used to recover from the recession. It is likely that the government increased its spending and cut taxes in order to stimulate growth and consumption, which creates a fiscal deficit and government spending becomes greater. Okay, forget what I just said there. You've got your K mark at the end there. One thing you could mention is the examples of the taxes and spending that happened. So in the Great Recession, there was a cut in VAT from 17.5% to 15%. And there was significant government spending in terms of things like the bank bailout, but also subsidies for businesses in terms of current spending. Explain the problems resulting from the deterioration in the public finances for the UK or any other country. As Extract 1 says, this public spending will be limited to just 0.7 in real terms, which severely limits the government's ability to provide public spending in future, meaning deep cuts in government departments. This is likely to have a negative impact on AD, which shifts to the left and limits economic growth. You could add a graph at this point to show that effect that you've just mentioned. So the fall in aggregate demand, so your shift to the left, AD to AD1. Then when you talk about falls in economic growth, you can say Y to Y1. These spending cuts are likely to lead to something in public services like infrastructure or healthcare, which would worsen standards of living. Further problems arise due to the increase in public sector debt, which is expected to reach 79%. This creates an opportunity cost of public spending. Governments may also need to raise taxes and spending the recovery due to. In terms of the opportunity cost, one of the key opportunity costs of debt is debt interest. And you don't get any benefits for that. So there's no, like, taking out debt in the first place and spending it, you get a positive, but you've got the debt, but the interest you don't get anything for. Okay, evaluate why the UK economy has fallen 2000. As Extract 2 says, the UK recovery has weakened as the economy has been exposed to a credit crisis through big banks. Social enterprise. This means that the UK banks like Northern Rock, credit crisis, meaning that the government bail them out. The result of the fall in investment. The fall in investment and consumer spending due to the low confidence, so the return cost of government spending. Maybe not go back through the opportunity cost of government spending again. Leads to a fall in aggregate demand. You've got the fall there. However, Extract 2 also shows that the fall in confidence led to a fall in the exchange rate, which actually helped to stabilise the economy as exports have become relatively cheaper. Nice and valuation there. Extent to which demand fell by 2009 by the fall by 40%, which is much bigger than other countries, and that the UK was not as weak as other export-led economies. So yes, that's kind of a nice evaluation in terms of scale. The other reasons that the UK became weak were that the biggest household debt, some of the means that the consumer's health is likely to fall, while Both sides will fall along with debt. So another negative there. Likely to solve the spending, education, and economics. Some application there. What's the question? If it's an evaluate question, you probably need an it depends upon here. So you did look at kind of the percentage of trade and how that was impacted on by the economy. You could talk about it in terms of if it is a short-term or a long-term change. So is this change permanent or temporary? Evaluate the effectiveness of monetary policy in management of the economy. 2 shows that the use of monetary policy in recovery from the recession. It says that the Bank of England cut interest rates from 5%, and that is combined with quantitative easing to encourage lending. Such a significant drop in interest rates is likely to incentivize customers to spend rather than save, as the gain from saving is so low, while debt repayment becomes cheaper. So people take out loans as well as the government assets and buying the money supply, because spending likely to create a positive multiplier. The graph shows the increasing AD. It's also showing the multiplier there, the secondary one. On the other hand, extract 2 also explains that impliedly the recession will cover debt. Well, consumer debt is high. That's a good point. Spending may not rise that much despite the reassurances to consumers. I think just one way to phrase that might just be that the banks might be unwilling to lend to consumers if they already have high levels of debt. So that if you have a significant amount of debt, if it's say greater than 80% of your income, then it might be unwilling for the banks to lend to you. It can be seen in order to fiscal policy. So I think that it depends upon, in terms of the other policy, that could be expanded a little bit more. So you could say it depends upon what the government does with fiscal policy, because if they do reduce taxes, then this has a secondary effect. So actually it reduces the marginal propensity to withdraw, which would increase the size of the multiplier, which would mean any effect that you have is going to be larger. Explain why some countries may experience a more severe recession than others. Some countries can experience a more severe recession due to being more dependent on exports. Yeah. It shows that there's different percentages here. Germany has fall of that in GDP. So by the economic growth, whilst exports are only 50% GDP, less developed countries are less likely to have lower value exports, so it's less of an impact. I think in terms of severe recession, what you would want to link this into a little bit is just the formula for aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and if you have a significant, or if that is a significant percentage of your GDP or aggregate demand, then that fall will lead to a fall in aggregate demand, which would reduce the economic growth of the real GDP, like you said. Assess the causes. The bank crisis hit the world so severely. Extract 1 says that world trade has been hit. Okay, you have the application here of trade. The interdependence of economies again, application. Exposed means that world trade has fallen significantly, and many developed economies are reliant on trade. So if one country has a fall in income, say that other countries will suffer from a fall in exports. You haven't answered the specific question here. The question is focused on the banking crisis and how that affects world trade. What you've done is said world trade's falling, and because other countries are interdependent here, then a fall in trade in one country is going to cause a fall in trade in another country. What you need to explain is what the banking crisis is, so a definition or an application, and then going into how that reduces trade. Let's just read it down a little bit and see if you do mention that. Another reason is that the recession is leading to saturation, which needs a reduction in imports, which may hit production on other. So again, you're coming at it from like the recession itself, not the banking crisis. So what the banking crisis is a crisis in credit, and there was a reduction in the supply of credit. Now, credit in terms of loans are needed to pay for goods and services by consumers. So there's a reduction in demand if consumers can't get access to credit, but also businesses need credit to buy stocks. So there's a reduction in stocks of goods and services and a reduction in supply by businesses. So less supply and less demand, which means that exports and imports reduce globally. So it's just that the key to that question is the banking crisis and what that is and how that has reduced world trade. Evaluate the likely economic effects of an increase in protectionism on the world economy. An increase in protectionism is likely to lead to damaging countries as their GDP is heavily reliant on their trade balance, like Japan. Protectionism is likely to result in less global, as there is a fall in competitiveness. This may have to reduce productive efficiency and be less reliant to cut costs. I think I would go straight into an example of protectionism. So I know you're kind of explaining some of the costs here, but as I can see here, you've got the tariff graph. I would just go straight into this. I would draw the tariff graph and, like you say, show the price falling, because your question that you're looking at is the economic effects. So you're looking at the kind of negative and positive impacts of protectionism. Drawing that graph straight away will give you a significant amount of analysis of why it is negative. So you've got the negative there of the consumer surplus, 1, 2, 3 and 4. You also have the quantities on the bottom. So because of that fall, the overall quantity will go down. So you're going to have the market equilibrium, or the actual supply of the good or service, whatever it is, and just make up some good or service. Say it's apples, for example. The total supply of apples is going to go from Q4 to Q3. So, but also at the same time, the price is going, again, don't forget your labels, from P to P1. And when it does that, that's going to be the thing that is linked to that consumer surplus or the loss of utility. You can go further and say that there is also an economic effect that the world suppliers will lose both of those quantities. So quantity 3 to 4 plus quantity 2 minus quantity 1. So that should be quantity 4 minus quantity 3. That's going to be the loss of supply from the world. So there's a loss to world businesses, there's a loss to domestic consumers, but then you've also got the gains, and Q2 minus Q1 is the gain to domestic producers, and that 1 is the gain in terms of producer surplus. There is also the 3 in here, which is your government tariff. So within that graph you've got costs and benefits. On the other hand, protectionism can be beneficial, especially for developing economies, as it can allow them to develop new industries without the fear of being competed against from developed economies. You can also just take that a little bit further in terms of until they gain economies of scale. So the argument you are making is the infant industry argument, which is businesses that start off, but you're protecting them until they gain economies of scale. Protectionism can also be beneficial in developed countries as it prevents structural employment. So we've got some more benefits there. Overall, protectionism is likely to be beneficial in the short term by allowing for the really for sunset industries and allowing developing economies to develop sunrise. However, in the long term, it encourages inefficiency and creates a welfare loss for consumers. So that's a nice way to kind of link it in terms of time. If you did have a little bit of extra time in the exam, you could also talk about how it distorts comparative advantages. So countries will not specialise in their advantages, and that will mean that total global supply will be less than it could be. And you could also talk in terms about, and it depends upon, is whether or not you are a member of the WTO, because protectionism in that situation is potentially illegal and it might lead to retaliation. And that's another way to kind of think about it. If a country retaliates against you, it cancels out the benefits that you're going to get from protectionism in the first place, like Donald Trump's potential trade war with China.